In our study of Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine, we are at the chapter where Sri Aurobindo describes the emergence of the spiritual being out of the mental being, and as a first step, he is leading us through the stages through which nature has prepared humanity in its inward turn, using four principal lines of development. The first being religion, the second being occultism, the third spiritual philosophy, and the fourth a direct spiritual experience. Of these four, Sri Aurobindo is leading us through a detailed exploration of the development of religions. Okay. And here, in the development of religions, he has taken us through a detailed description of three broad stages of the religious development. First, where religion begins in what is almost an instinctive, vital sense or perception of the hidden, the presence which is felt as if opening out to something infinite or invisible, and that grows bit by bit, organizing around it certain relationships, practices, and so on. And all of this is still at the level of the vital consciousness primarily. If at all there is development of mind, it is still the turn of the mind to the vital mind, the turn to life force and emotions, not the pure reason. And at that level, many things are felt and known without needing rational satisfaction. Sometimes they may seem irrational, but you feel and you know, and that is good enough. We see this, of course, in the more primitive societies. But then comes the emergence of the intellect proper, which begins to question, which begins to organize these experiences. And we saw in great detail Sri Aurobindo describing how the superstructure of the intellect begins to suffocate this lower grade of living experience. And as a result, religion and its forms tend to break away into distinct parts. Occultism separates, mystic experience separates, and religion, the mentalization of religion often leads to creation of institutions, creeds, formal practices, and ethics, which is the work of the mind. But what the mind does in the process, it tries to lift the earlier grade of knowledge and experience into its terms. The only problem is, as mind, it is ill-equipped to have a direct sense. So in the more instinctive, vital part of our consciousness, we feel and know. In the mind, things tend to be reduced to a reasoning knowledge which is often disconnected from reality. And often we try to impose our understanding upon the reality and try to make it fit into the understanding. And of course it fails. And the only way the purpose of mind can be fulfilled is by not stopping with mind but going a step above into a more intuitive knowing, where again one begins to feel and know directly but in clear light of awareness, which is not irrational but supra-rational. But in this transitional point where the mind has begun to dominate, nature still keeps her deeper purpose and cuts through this intellectualization to retain something of the original experience. And the intellect itself begins to remove whatever is irrational, trying to reduce the elements of living experience to its terms, often ending up with nothing, or a complete rejection even of all the religious experience. And after a while, when it finds itself hollow and empty, it turns back to the religious truths or experiences to find in it what it is missing and to again give it new form. And this second phase of mind turning back upon what brought this experience to a higher grade and then giving a new form is a passage which every religion has to pass through. And you will see this happening in most of the great religions of the world in the last 200 or 300 years in particular. And those religions in which this movement has not been sufficiently made are the ones which are in crisis today, facing internal conflicts of reason with belief. So from the infra-rational stage, religion passes through a kind of a rational passage towards a supra-rational experience. And Sri Aurobindo gives a detailed description of how this has happened in the evidence that we have, particularly of this second stage. But then, this is the paragraph we are at. Out of this second stage, there emerged a third, which tried to liberate the secret spiritual experience and knowledge and put it at the disposal of all, as a truth that could have a common appeal and must be made universally available. So through this passage where intellect was almost suffocating the living power of religion, occultism broke away to retain some aspect of the power of religion. Mysticism separated, formed into secret schools, created a double layer of knowledge, an inner core that retained experience, and an outer symbolic form which was given to people. But here, the third stage demands this need that the knowledge should be spread to all and should be made available to all. So a tendency prevailed not only to make the spiritual element the very kernel of the religion, but to render it attainable to all the worshippers by an exoteric teaching. An external form is given which everybody can access. As each esoteric school had its system of knowledge and discipline, so now each religion was to have its system of knowledge, its creed, and its spiritual discipline. So now we see two things. The core, which is esoteric and holding the inner secrecies, which has its own discipline to protect the purity even of the vehicle which is seeking the experience and the knowledge itself. And then there is an outer layer, the exoteric, where also a discipline is given and a form is given and a teaching brought out. And between the two, there must be some correspondence, but the gap equally is strong. But now he points out, why is this necessary? This is part of nature's method. And so there is nothing that we can do to avoid it. Nature goes through these phases of concentration followed by dispersal. So he explains this. Here in these two forms of the spiritual evolution, the esoteric and the exoteric, the way of the mystic and the way of the religious man, we see a double principle of evolutionary nature. The principle of intensive and concentrated evolution in a small space, and the principle of expansion and extension, so that the new creation may be generalized in as large a field as possible. And we had paused after this sentence. We had dwelt in great detail on the distinction between expansion and extension and the importance of this concentration, intensification, which is at the core. Now you will recall in the very beginning of the synthesis of yoga, Sri Aurobindo gives us a similar description of how nature builds, let's say, a body of experience. And out of that, she develops specializations. And the specializations are pushed to their extreme until they seem to be almost contradictory to each other. And then once again, she brings them back to create a rich integration. And at that point, there's an outburst of a rich variety of possibilities. And then once that is sufficiently stabilized, again out of that, a series of specializations, and later again an integration to create something more rich. And something of that you will see reflected here. Here in this description, there is only the expansion, the concentration and expansion. There is not that aspect of specializations. But if you take that idea and join with this, you get the most complete picture. In any expansion, necessarily there will be adaptations to the areas where you expand, to the groups of people that you reach, to the different needs of the larger mass. And with it will develop some kind of specializations. When that dilution is too great, necessarily once again there will be a need to bring together and deepen in concentration. So, although they are different in description, you see how the two are complementary to each other. He continues, the first is the concentrated, dynamic and effective movement. The second tends towards diffusion and status. So in the first, where the concentration was made, he uses these words, concentrated, dynamic and effective movement. It's not static. It's always growing and therefore it is in a movement. It is intense in its concentration, but the concentration itself is dynamic. It is again not staying fixed in concentration. In the concentration itself, there is a repeated development and growth that is being built up. And the movement is effective. It aims at an outcome, at a result. And always there is a rapid pace of growth and change. But in the second movement, he uses two words, diffusion and status. Diffusion, if you see in the use of the word in physics, you have, let's say, a mass of air and some gas is released on one end. Bit by bit, the molecules mix in and spread. And the way they diffuse, the mass of air seems to be exactly where it was, but something of the new has entered and got mixed. But it seems as if the mass of air was still there. It has not moved. There has not been a force that blew away like a wind. And so the sense of diffusion here in the spiritual context is a society which is busy doing what it wants, and something of the spiritual force and ideas begins now to creep into it and spread between the cracks and gaps, and gradually influencing, changing bit by bit. But society is busy doing exactly what it wants. It's not really interested. It's not actively absorbing. And that's the sense of this word diffusion. And the other word is status. Things come to a certain static condition. And because society itself being aiming at status, what spreads from the spiritual also tends to settle into status. And you will see this in all of the religions. Once the founder and the core team around the founder has passed on, the institutionalization often involves stabilizing and fixing. And once that is sufficiently done, the institution is afraid of sudden changes because it might disrupt stability. Everywhere we see this. And depending on the nature of the movement, on the greatness of the ideal which is attempted, it happens sooner or later. As a result of this new development, the spiritual aspiration, at first carefully treasured by a few, became more generalized in mankind, but it lost in purity, height, and intensity. So something has spread, and I think we dwelt on this last time also. The loss of purity, the loss of the height, and the loss of intensity. These are three dimensions by which we can measure the sense of our progress spiritually. And it's a useful reference in our own consciousness. Over the years, has my consciousness grown more clear, more pure, less mixed, less confused? And if there has been that, we can say, yes, there is a growth. Has my consciousness grown in height? And where earlier I was at a much more low grade of awareness, now I can feel and perceive things in a wider, deeper range, higher range. And the third is the aspect of intensity. Is my relationship with the divine more deep, more intimate, more intense? And that's again a measure. But this will apply not only in the direct aspect of experience, it applies equally to the knowledge, which includes the third path of, of spiritual philosophy. It applies also to the aspect of occultism. In the occult aspect of the religion, there is also this element of purity, height, and intensity, which would make for it to be valuable. In the loss of purity or height or intensity, the occultism itself loses any value for the spirit and becomes perverse even. But to the benefit of a generalization for humanity, the mystics founded their endeavor on a power of supra-rational knowledge, intuitive, inspired, revelatory, and on the force of the inner being to enter into occult truth and experience. But these powers are not possessed by men in the mass, or possessed only in a crude, undeveloped, and fragmentary initial form on which nothing could be safely founded. So for them, this new development of spiritual truth had to be clothed in intellectual forms of creed and doctrine, etc. Now here we see the distinction between the two. When the mystics made their effort, what was the basis of their journey? What drove their forward movement? And this is extremely important for us as practitioners of the yoga. The two primary drivers of this endeavor is power of supra-rational knowledge, to which he gives 3 adjectives, and force of the inner being to enter into occult truth and experience. So here is something, we are beginning to enter a domain which is hidden. Where is spirit? I am told it is immanent, I am told it is everywhere, I am told it is within my heart, I am told it is above me, but I don't feel it. How do we enter into the experience of the spirit? Well, there is this concentration of the force of your consciousness. Not your surface concentration, but an inner concentration. And therefore, inevitably, there's an inward turn to gather in a deeper part. And there, in a gathered focus, one begins to turn to enter in relation with the spirit. And the force of that inner being is your means to enter. We may even use the word willpower, but of a deeper inner grade of consciousness. The other is power of supra-rational knowledge. That something within you already knows, although I can't explain how. I know there is this thing, I feel this presence, I feel a kind of I don't know what to say, but I feel it. And that combined with the force of this concentration on an inner plane, on an inner part, these two things combining make for the result. If you dwell on the deeper sense of it, it goes to the very heart of the method of the integral yoga, which Sri Aurobindo has described as the direct method. And he explains in the Synthesis of Yoga how this boils down to use a more superficial vocabulary, faith as a knowledge of the soul, a deeper knowing which is supra-rational, and willpower, which is the gathered, concentrated force of your awareness, which leads to an experience or a breakthrough, cuts through appearances or something felt intuitively or supra-rationally, and the will concentrating on it makes for the connection for this now to be released as a full experience. This is at the core of the whole process of spiritual development. Any technique, any method, any procedure which may be taught by religions or various systems of yoga or occult practice are only as effective as these two powers are effective in them. The form of the practice, of the ritual or the process given is secondary. They are means for these two powers to be able to concentrate and direct themselves. You can throw out the form completely and hold on to these two and get the same result, or replace that form with a completely different form, and if these two are aligned, you will get the same result. So what he is describing here is a very interesting way of looking at it. He has not used the word faith, because it would have a very different meaning here. For the mystics, the faith, we replace the word by deeper knowledge of the soul or supra-rational knowledge. So, the mystics founded their endeavor on a power of supra-rational knowledge, and that's a power. And on the other side, on the force of the inner being to enter into occult truth and experience. So the supra-rational knowledge gives you a glimpse of that occult truth or experience, and then the force of the inner being is this direction of the will which penetrates, cuts through and attains to. The supra-rational knowledge itself has three aspects: intuitive, inspired, revelatory. And you will recall these are the three facets of intuition. And there is a fourth power of intuition, which is the discriminative power, which is inherent in these three, of course. But these are three facets of intuition. When we speak of intuition, intuitive proper, in the experience, we mean something in my consciousness enters in contact with a deeper truth, and in the contact becomes what it touches and knows, therefore, in contact. But there is a variation to this, which is inspiration, in which the truth is felt not in a contact of consciousness in essence, but in form of word. It is as if the intuitive knowledge takes on a form that flows in speech or poetry, or sometimes in speech in its most general sense, in action. So you express in gesture which is spontaneous, or in dance which is spontaneous, or music which is spontaneous, or poetry which is spontaneous. All these are aspects of Vak, the essential power of creative speech. But in this case, you see, the intuition is flowing into form, and there could be many forms. But the form itself has as if a clothing. Unlike the pure intuitive contact, where the knowledge is known in identity, in the inspiration, the flowing into form, although gives you a form that is tangible, there may still be a gap in our understanding of the form. So you will see one of the sadhaks in the ashram, Nirodbaran, experiences this inspiration from the gift that Sri Aurobindo gives him. He writes wonderful poetry, sends it to Sri Aurobindo and says, "Guru, please explain. I don't know what I have written." He senses it, but his mind is unable to keep up with this formulation of the inspiration. And the third way in which the intuition comes is in a revelation, where there is an imaging. And in the imaging, you see a form in a picturized form. And again, there are finer gradations of this. If the imaging reflects in the mental consciousness, you see a symbol. For example, you may see a swan leaping up to fly in the sky. And of course, we know in the yoga tradition, this represents the journeying soul. But sometimes the images may not be too obvious. There is a moon and there's a cloud which comes and covers the moon and then moves away again. What do you mean? So mind needs to interpret, especially if it is in the level of the mind. And this is why we often don't understand what happens in our dreams. We feel something special happened, but I don't know what it means. Somebody has a dream in which he sees himself in his house. There's a huge storm happening outside, and the wind is so intense that bit by bit the boards of the house are pulled away and the house begins to fall apart. But he experiences himself in a state of intense calm, unaffected, undisturbed, even while the violent storm is going on outside. What would it mean? And at this point, if you really want to understand, you have to lean into the intuitive part of you. And then you sense, this calm is me in my center. my inner being. And the storm is the violent force of change of outer life. The house represents for you your form of security and safety, and perhaps even identity. And the breaking down of the house is the breaking down of your old form of security and identity by the force of changing circumstances. But within you, you are solid, contained, and sure that you will come through, and it is all for the good. Now, in the dream itself, you may not see a new house being built. It's not relevant. It is the nature of the transition which has been captured in the symbol. But what you see in the nature of revelation is, although it comes into form which is imaged, at what level does it happen? You still need to lean into a more intuitive poise to understand, if it is at a lower level that you have the perception. So at the end of it, the true revelation is not the picture, but the intuitive imaging taking place at a higher level in a consciousness which is intuitive. So when we enter the intuitive consciousness, these are the three ways in which the knowledge reveals. First, by touch of identity, where you are it. It's the most intimate. Second, in a flow that streams to give to it a form of action, expressive. Third, a revelatory, but often therefore couched in the symbolism and difficult to translate, if not perceived directly in its origin. So these are the three powers of supra-rational knowledge with which the mystics founded their endeavor, on which they founded their endeavor. Now, if you go back to the beginnings of any religious form, especially the more formal beginnings. Now, there are religions which don't seem to have a beginning. And there you'll find a series of, let's say, mystics or teachers who come with something of one of these three aspects of the intuitive knowledge. In more formed traditions, you'll have somebody who went to a mountaintop and had a revelation, an image seen, a burning bush, or words flowed that he transcribed, which were as if the guidance received from God, which becomes the basis for the holy book. And even there is a tradition in Islam that during a certain period of this transcription, the Prophet recognized that the words which had come through were not from God, but were actually of a satanic origin, and he cuts them out. That he was conscious that he was only a prophet, a translator, transcriber of something which was inherently of a higher grade of consciousness, which he was linking to. And the problem with that, again, is the problem that comes with all these inspired and revelatory forms, that there is always translation, somebody who needs to come and say, that's what this verse means. And then all the other problems which follow with it. But in all these, you will find something which came from above and then was as if transmitted to a larger body of people. And the other side is force of inner being to enter into occult truth and experience. And this again you will see in many of the stories of the founders. Before such a descent could take place of experience, they were alone, wandering in the desert or in the mountains or in the forest in a gathered, concentrated, one-pointed quest to find something. And it was that which led to the breakthrough. But these powers are not possessed by men in the mass. How many people can say, oh, I can receive at will a flow of intuition or revelation, or even concentrate to enter into some deeper occult domain of consciousness? But he says, they are not possessed by men in the mass, or possessed only in a crude, undeveloped and fragmentary initial form. Now this is very important, because this description fits all of us. All of us have already these abilities, but in a crude, undeveloped and fragmentary initial form. Now you could have crude, undeveloped and fragmentary, but more developed. But this is at a very initial form. So initial that you can hardly recognize it. It happens inevitably for all of us. We have dreams. And then later something happens, we say, oh yes, you know what, I had dreamt of it. I knew something was going to happen. I recently heard a fascinating story by someone who had an ashram in Rishikesh, and repeatedly he would have a dream vision in which he saw the Ganga rushing through and eating up a large part of the land on which his ashram was founded. He didn't know what to make of it at first. He would say it to his students. But one night, suddenly this thing came in a strong form, it's tonight. And so he didn't sleep, he stayed awake. And at 2 a.m. there was this huge cloudburst, and the rush of the Ganga began to eat away at the land, and he lost a large part of the property. That kind of clarity of transmission, difficult for most of us. Most of us have it in hindsight. The thing happens and we say, oh yes, you know what, I had a vague feeling something is going to be like that. It's crude, it's not yet refined, undeveloped, we have not trained it, and if we trained, we could take it very far, even to the point where you could consciously reach out and sense what are the trends for the coming future. And fragmentary. When it happens, briefly it happens, and it never catches the full picture. You sense something, but I don't know what it is that I sense. And of course, initial form. The result is that nothing could be safely founded on this. So if someone comes to a mystic who has this power to reach and says, teach me, but the person doesn't have the ability to concentrate on the inner layers, to cross over into an experience or to receive the flow of the supra-rational knowledge, what can the mystic do? Well, I can only give you exercises which will prepare you in developing this ability by which you could get into the whole thing. That's the best you can do. But nothing can be safely founded. You can give an experience to the person, and the mystic is capable of that. And if the student is sufficiently receptive, he can imprint the experience, and the student has the experience, but he cannot hold. Or what he receives is partial and fragmentary. Or in the very act of receiving, he warps to fit into his current incapacity or prejudice. Sri Aurobindo actually has a very interesting letter when Dilip Kumar Roy was here in the ashram. Sri Aurobindo gave him a lot of love and affection and care and help. The longest letters of Sri Aurobindo are to Dilip Kumar Roy, and the largest numbers probably also, if you see in sheer number of pages. And most of these letters are trying to convince Dilip Kumar Roy that don't worry, you will be well, and because he had severe conflicts internally and so on. But he was a great disciple of Sri Krishna, and somehow he had fixated himself in that particular form. And every time that Sri Aurobindo would try to help him, he was unable to receive something which would widen him out to a larger experience of Krishna, but in the wider sense of the divine. But he had this fixity of the form. And so Nirodha once asked Sri Aurobindo, why don't you reveal yourself to him and solve this problem once and for all? And Sri Aurobindo writes back saying, every time I do that, he only sees Krishna and begins to dance in frenzy around Krishna. Because his mind was so fixated that whenever there was this afflatus of the divine revelation, he had to fit it into this picture that he had, and the way he could relate to it was to start singing in a frenzy of song. He could never hold in a stable, wide and receptive base in which the experience could unveil its full power. And this is, of course, already a developed person. But it's a good example to understand why things cannot be safely established. And when Sri Aurobindo left his body, he was one of those who left the ashram, in fact, and went and founded his own ashram where he continued to sing the name of Sri Krishna, inspired many in the chant. But the spiritual potential which was available to him, he could never go beyond that which was his limited capacity. But now consider this problem taken on a much lower level of development of capacity. Sri Aurobindo recalls an example of a person who came to him and said, I want to have the experience of silence of mind. And Sri Aurobindo was at that time in his intense sadhana. He asked the person to sit down. And he has the newspaper in his hands and he went on reading. He was scanning through to see the general trend of events. And this person sat down, and after a few minutes, he was invaded by this silence of mind. And he found he couldn't contain it. His mind stopped working, and he suddenly jumped up and shouted, I'm going mad, and ran away. And Sri Aurobindo gives this example as somebody who was not yet ready to receive the experience. The mystic is able to give the experience, but if the receptivity is not there, it can even harm the evolution of the person. Now suddenly he may associate that experience of silence of mind with fear, because the fear at that point was so strong, it could be visceral, and thereafter his spiritual potential may be warped, and he would not want to face this, and it would have to go in all kinds of indirect paths before perhaps gradually reapproaching this experience, which is in any case a capital experience before which you can enter into higher ranges. So a premature experience can even be more harmful than helpful. So, and nothing can be safely founded, and the word safety here is important. It can actually cause disruption if premature. So for them, in this new development, what is the new development? That nature wants now to extend and expand, to make available the spiritual core and secret experience and knowledge to all. So for them in this new development, the spiritual truth had to be clothed. What's the kind of clothing? A clothing covers. Clothing does two things. It protects the truth from being sullied by the mud outside, but equally to the person for whom the spiritual truth is too hot, the clothing dims it and makes it now tangible. If you're carrying a piece of pure uranium, the radiation would destroy you. So you clothe it in a lead casing that now you can safely carry. And you may still feel the warmth of the uranium, but just as much as you're ready to have. If you take a bulb that is too bright, your eyes look at it straight, it burns your eyes. So you clothe it and diffuse the light a little bit, make it manageable. How much do you need to clothe depending on your capacity? But the clothing is of many kinds, and in this case it describes three clothings. And why three, you will see in the description. Had to be clothed in intellectual forms of creed and doctrine, in emotional forms of worship, and in a simple but significant ritual. Now you see, these three correspond to the three parts of our nature which are not supra-rational. Supra-rational knowledge, which is above mind, now needs to meet clothing of these three: mind, emotion, and action. So the clothing of mind is intellectual form of creed and a doctrine. Here is what you believe, here is what you follow, and that captures the truth, but in the form of the belief. Second is the emotion. The heart's turn is to worship. Worship the truth, worship the presence, worship the light and force. How do you do that? Well, you open your heart in love. What do you get as a result, or how do you perceive? It's only through the heart. And the love of the heart feels the closeness, feels the intimacy, feels the joy, or sometimes feels overwhelmed. And that's enough. I've had my morning prayer, puja, worship of devotion. I feel good, I feel regenerated and ready for my day, and now I go back to my day. And third, in action, a simple but significant ritual. Now, if it's not simple, common man cannot follow. If it is too simple and having no meaning, common man feels nothing in it, it's hollow. So it has to have significance, meaning it has to have a power that represents the truth, that you can feel something, and yet simplified sufficiently. If you see some of the modern movements, and I mean in the last 10 or 20 years, some of the movements which have become very popular, you'll find each of these movements has a particular formulation of ritual practice. And the founder begins to spread the movement by teaching these ritual practices. And they're very simple. You're asked to do this 5 minutes or 10 minutes every day. They may have absolutely zero spiritual value, but they have to have significance, meaning having done it, you feel something. So in recent times, one of the famous movements has a practice called Sudarshan Kriya. Now the name is unimportant. It's a standard practice of pranayam, of bhastrika, where you do a rapid breathing. It's given a name which allows it to be patented or made relevant to a particular movement. And everybody who follows is asked to practice this. By itself, it gives you a boost of energy and vitality, makes you fresh for the day. And that's accessible to everybody. Does it in itself lead to spirituality? Not necessarily. But since it is accessible enough, the movement distinguishes itself by this unique practice. Or others similarly have different practices. Simple but significant ritual. It could be other forms. Every morning or every evening, you will light a lamp, say a prayer. There is another movement which is which teaches, I think it's associated with the Gayatri Mantra. The name I'm not sure now. Every evening at the time when the sun sets, they have a little metal yajna kunda, the vessel in which you do the fire ceremony. Into that you put certain things, repeat the mantra, do it 3 times, and there's smoke and a certain smell that spreads, and there's a shift in atmosphere that you can feel. But you must do it at the time when the sun is setting, because it's the joint between the day and night. That's the gap through which you can access something deeper and higher more easily. At least that's the rationale of the occult influence. And it does make a difference if you do it at that time or a different time. But in all these, the person is tied to the form of the ritual, or the form of the worship, or the form of the intellectual creed or doctrine. There's a whole bhakti, devotional movement, in which the form of worship is, you have a little idol of Sri Krishna, let's say, and you have to look after it as if your own child. So every morning, what do you do to your child? You wake him up from sleep. You bathe him and clothe him, and then leave him there. And every evening, you will take the child, change his clothing, and put him back to sleep. Very simple ritual. But if done with concentration, with genuine love and care, the people who practice enter into such beautiful experiences in their intimacy of relationship with the divine as a child. But you can easily see how the ritual could degrade into mechanical form. For many of the practitioners, the relationship grows so human, let's say, that every now and then they have to buy new clothes for the baby god, deity, and sometimes they have boxfuls of clothing for one little idol. And somehow the fact that you have more clothing satisfies the heart. I have done so much for my child, isn't it? And it satisfies on that one level. Now if you see, these are 3 distinct parts within us. All 3 are being put in relation to a supra-rational knowledge experience. Each translates or reduces it to its own terms. The most complete would be you have all 3, which is what you see in the more sophisticated forms of religions. They try to address all 3 needs. Of course, that already takes it away from common mass. But the common mass then tends to reduce further to that which is more relevant for them. So for them, in this new development, the spiritual truth had to be clothed in intellectual forms of creed and doctrine, in emotional forms of worship, and in a simple but significant ritual. So creed and doctrine, of course, I have not taken good examples, but one would be, for example, the fact that God is always watching you. So everything you do, you must make sure you do according to what He would want. Simple. But what would He want? So now comes the complexity. You might have a whole list of texts which say God wants this and does not want that. This is acceptable, that is not acceptable. And then it can get more and more complicated. Very quickly though, you'll find people beginning to react and withdraw or question and cut. There's a very interesting incident Most of the Buddha's teaching, by the way, most of his teachings were recorded by one of his premier disciples who was a brilliant intellectual and with an extraordinary power of memory. So the Buddha would give a speech, this man would know by memory and would write it down later. It so happens, over time, as things were going on, somebody got ill eating a particular kind of meat. So the Buddha said, hereafter we will stop eating this meat. Another time, some event happened. It happened because the timing was wrong. So he said, hereafter at this time we will not do such and such a thing. Bit by bit, in the little group that was wandering with him, rules began to be added for the good health, for example, or well-being of the group. Some of them had spiritual intentions, some of them had purely hygienic or social objectives. Towards the end of his life, the number of rules had gone into several hundred. And as the Buddha was preparing to leave his body, this premier disciple asked the Buddha, a lot of our disciples feel that there are too many rules. Can we simplify them? And the Buddha said, yes, go ahead and remove all the ones which are unnecessary, keeping only the important ones, the necessary ones. And so the premier disciple says, yes, wonderful, thank you. So after the Buddha leaves his body, he goes, meets the disciples and says, this is the conversation. And the Buddha said, yes, we can remove the ones which are unnecessary. And the disciples stare at him and ask, which ones are unnecessary and which is necessary? And he says, oh my God, I forgot to ask that. So as it appears, as I was told by one of the Buddhists, in various traditions, they make a different selection of what is necessary and what is not. But you see here the idea that even in giving a form, there are forms which are central to the teaching and then forms which are successively more and more distant. And somewhere along the way, there is a need for constant readjustment of forms on all three levels. At the same time, the strong spiritual nucleus became mixed, diluted, alloyed. It tended to be invaded and aped by the lower elements of mind and life and physical nature. Obvious? The moment you have taken a supra-rational truth and experience and put it into mind, life and nature, what do these three do? They don't have the direct experience. So, the strong spiritual nucleus became mixed, diluted, alloyed, and we'll see the importance of these three words. Tended to be invaded by lower elements of mind, life, and physical nature, and aped by lower elements. Again, what these two are, we will see with a few examples. So the strong spiritual nucleus of the whole religion, of the whole movement, let's say. If not for the strong spiritual nucleus, there would be no religion. Because people are drawn to something they feel. Even if instinctively or intuitively, it's only when they feel something of the presence, they say, here is something. If they feel nothing, well, nobody is going to follow. What they feel may not be spiritual, it may be purely vital. And there have been many great movements which have been led by strong vital personalities. Sometimes there was a spiritual component, weaker or stronger. But if the vitality was strong for most people, that's enough to create a strong attraction. Still, let's assume there's a strong spiritual nucleus. It became mixed, diluted, alloyed. And we look at these three words. Mixture is, let's say, you take sand, which is red colored, or a powder which is red colored, and a powder which is blue colored, and you mix the two. They are distinct pieces. You take pebbles, and you take mud, and you mix the two. They are distinct things, and you mix them in a way that the distinction of the two is still there, at least in pieces. But in the mass, it's difficult to separate. So the mixture is what has the character of confusion. Into this strong spiritual nucleus, there are elements which come which have nothing to do with the spirituality, but have got mixed in because of certain social conditionings, often dress code associated with the founder. The founder wore such and such a dress, and now this becomes extremely important for all the followers. Why? Because the founder did it. Why did he do it? Because it was a cold place. So for many Buddhists, for example, because the origin of that tradition or lineage is in the Tibetan plateau, they wear 3 layers of clothing. Except now when they've migrated to the warm climate, they still have to wear 3 layers of clothing because that is the distinctive character of the lineage, dress code and practice. And they're perspiring, but that's part of the discipline to suffer. Does it help the spiritual concentration? Unlikely. For some, it becomes an act of will, which of course may help the spiritual growth, but the willpower developing through a process of suffering is maybe not the easiest way. But the mixtures can come also in the core teachings, where, for example, in Christianity, there was the concept of merciful God or a loving God. But the origins of Christianity being in a tradition in which God had to be feared, and you had the wrath of God and the anger of God and the jealousy of God, although there is a transition into a loving God which Christ brings, that has not been entirely separated. And so the church brings back secretly fear of God. God is all merciful, but if you do not follow what He has willed, which we are telling you to do, then you will have the wrath of God or the punishment of God after death or whatever form. The mixture is fundamentally contrary to the teaching, and yet it manages to survive and get mixed in. So with the stone, with the mud which would have been fertile comes the stone which is hard and contradicting it. Dilution is different. In dilution, there is the sense of weakening. An acid is diluted, its ability to cut through is weakened. And so the force which was there has got weakened in the dilution. In the context of the ashram, you will see this was extremely important in the early phase of the ashram. And Sri Aurobindo took great pains to ensure that nothing was allowed to come into the physical space around even the main building of the ashram, into the collective life of the community which was centered around the main building, which could dilute or bring contrary vibrations. And so even people were not allowed to come here if they did not have a certain readiness in consciousness. At one point, the project had been taken to build a housing for the ashramites, and which became Golkund. And it was meant to be for housing ashramites. Later it became a guest house by some incidental historical event. But it was meant to be for people to live as for sadhakas. So as it was about to be built, the best designers had been brought, the best architects, the best engineers. They said you will need about, I think it was 500 workers to finish it within 6 months. And Sri Aurobindo said, no, unacceptable. It would bring too much of a dilution in the general atmosphere around the ashram and spoil the work being done. So it was accepted that there would be only, I think, 50 workers. And it was 1/10 of the number, whatever the number was. And it took 6 years, 5 years or 6 years to finish. But they accepted that compromise rather than allow the dilution which this mass would have brought. It was a time of intense concentration, intense presence. The presence was physically palpable. You could walk into this space and you would feel as if you're entering a dense liquid or air, palpably growing denser as you approach the physical space of the ashram. You can still feel that sometimes when there are less visitors, tourists are less, and you walk towards the ashram from a distance of 2 blocks about, you can still feel those layers, but now more diluted. Under the place where the mother used to give darshan, for a long time, you walked in, and especially in the evenings when there was nobody, you could feel as if you're entering this dense presence, as if you're walking through a dense substance, and it was so strong. People would spontaneously sit down and meditate. And then at some point the government decided, it is some 50th or 100th anniversary of some event, so we'll do the ashram a good favor. And they dug up all the soil of the road, took it away and threw it away, and brought river sand, filling it, and put bricks on top. And you could feel the power vanish. The entire footpath was dug up, material thrown out. The stones on which the mother had walked were removed and thrown away to be replaced by these bricks of cement. You could feel the density gone. I was hoping to see if the presence would come back and refill. Well, it has not yet happened, at least in my experience, it has come nowhere near that density. But this sense of dilution is inevitable the moment you open out, spread out, or allow an invasion from outside. And with it comes the weakening of the intensity. So it's the second type of change. Third is alloyed. And alloy is a different character. You see, when something is mixed, you can still separate the stone from the mud because it's distinct. If it is diluted, well, it still does something. But in the dilution, there might be a way to perhaps separate what has been brought in. But alloyed has a different character. It has the sense of first solid metal into which you mix another metal, and the mixture is blended in so deeply that the character and quality of the metal changes substantially. And so the substance of the teaching, the substance of the experience itself has got now changed as a result of this other metal which has been brought in. So it is the loss of purity which is the nature of the alloyed. So at the same time, the strong spiritual nucleus became mixed, elements of confusion, diluted, weakening therefore, alloyed, which is the loss of purity. And then now he explains, so as this widening is taking place, the teaching is undergoing these three things, and at the same time from outside something is coming in to what was the spiritual nucleus. It tended to be invaded and aped by the lower elements of mind and life and physical nature. Now this needs some elaboration. First of all, he is not blaming the mind, life and physical nature in itself, but only the lower elements of mind, life and physical nature. So in our mind, we have the higher elements. These are the parts of our mind which say, oh, I want this very beautiful thing. And then there are other parts of the mind that say, yes, but this is more important, that can wait. And that's the lower part, which gives a different value, a different priority, which suddenly focuses on appearance rather than the content behind the appearance. And the same happens with the impulse of life force, the heart's emotions, and of physical nature in particular, where there are often instinctive forms and instincts and drives which can bring in a lot of other things. So these lower elements of mind, life, and physical nature invade and ape that strong spiritual nucleus. So in the invasion, they are bringing their values into it. One of the things that the mother did not want for a long time in the ashram was for parents to come and take away their children for holidays. Because she worked on the children to infuse into them a new value, a new consciousness. And she said every time they go out, even if it is for a month, they come back, everything is washed out. But the same thing happens even if they don't go out, if people from outside now come and bring those values and fill them in. So the mother was very careful who she chose in the dining room, those who prepared the food. You'll see how important this is in terms of consciousness. The people who prepare the food, their consciousness enters the food. The people who eat the food, they take in the consciousness in a physical substantiality which then spreads into the body and works from within. If the person who has prepared the food had an outburst of anger, as you eat the food, you're likely to have an indigestion, because that anger energy is going to create some chaotic force. And if you're very sensitive, it's as if the body feels this alien energy and wants to throw it out. How best does it throw out? By purging, either upward or downward. Indigestion of some form. But if they bring in a certain value of consciousness which is not too strong to be purged, but now is accepted and begins to fill the body, you will find after a while suddenly your mind begin to think differently. And you'll find it begins to reflect the people who are preparing the food. So for the mother and Sri Aurobindo's food, it did not come from the ashram's community kitchen. They had a separate kitchen where a special food was prepared. And the person who was running the mother's kitchen, who would prepare the food for the mother and Sri Aurobindo, was one of the persons in the ashram to whom Sri Aurobindo made a reference to say that she has experiences of the Upanishadic kind without knowing what they are, because she has not read that text to recognize what it is. So here's a person of a very high spiritual order, we will say, in terms of experience. And she is asked to prepare the food. And there's an incident which is recorded where they had washed some grapes and kept them to dry. And somebody passed by on the road and saw the grapes and said, "Oh, how nice those grapes are." And later, the grapes were turned into juice and given to the mother. She took one sip and set it aside. That energy of the person who had seen with avarice was attached and was in it, and she could feel the difference. And I've also mentioned this other incident, which was of the fruit juices which were being given to her. One day she called Dyuman Bhai, who was in charge of the farms of the ashram, and said to him, "Can you give me these fruits or these juices which do not have the poison in it?" And she meant the insecticides and fertilizers which were being put extensively. She could feel the result of that on her body. But all this is to say that the importance given to who prepares the food and in what state of consciousness was extreme. Those who were in the dining room, similarly for the community kitchen, were people selected of a certain grade. Much later, there was a sudden influx of people who came not for sadhana, but for economic comfort and opportunity. And many of them were sent to the dining room. They were often teenagers. They had a lot of teenage problems, including sexual problems. And during that rush, about 100 of them were there. And the whole shift could be felt in the food itself. And this was because the people who made the decision to send them there were oblivious to the importance of consciousness in the food, or themselves were insensitive to it. But all this is to say that the invasion will come in many forms. And I took food as an example because it's something which is so fundamental to the purity of the physical consciousness. But invasion of ideas, invasion of values. One of the questions which would often be asked in context of Sri Aurobindo's ashram, people coming from outside, from many religious traditions, conventional religious traditions, would say, "What do you do here in the ashram?" "Oh, people are working." "Yes, but how is it an ashram? Where is the charity? Do you run hospitals? Do you run schools for poor people?" And it was an idea that spirituality or an ashram was to be associated with some kind of charity. And if you don't see charity, where is the spirituality? If such a person comes in and at some point is given responsibility, decision-making responsibility, well, obviously he's going to warp priorities in the direction. Another even more serious mixture is the ascetic taint, of which Sri Aurobindo and the mother were very careful. Although many of the sadhaks came with the background of an ascetic practice, because that's how they began. Coming here, necessarily they had to undergo a shift. Not all could do it entirely. And so you still find elements or taints of this, where somebody who wears clothes which are beautiful, elegant, and even radiating in beauty or in taste, is looked at and, oh, that person is still very attached, not free from attachment. I've seen this happen, and I've myself been a victim of this at various stages in my school days. We had one teacher who would come with the most flashy clothes, with a matching color of umbrella with her sari and shoes matching in color. And we would all look at her and say, wow, what is that? Is she an ashramite? Because that was associated with people of the normal life. But it's only later, when I understood more deeply the sense of what was attempted, that I could recognize the value of what she had. I don't know if she herself did it with that sense, but the fact that she did it was extremely precious. And then I could see others who did it, maybe in not so obvious a form of clothing, but in the elegance and in the beauty and the aesthetics of the way they wore their clothes or walked or arranged things in their life. Mother was asked once by one of the youngsters, again with the taint of the ascetic, and the young girl asks mother, Mother, why do you wear lipsticks and beautiful saris? And mother said, do you want the divine to be clothed in ugliness? And it made a lot of people think. And you see the people who worked closest with the mother, all of them developed this elegance and neatness and beauty down to the detail. I've seen my teacher, MP Pandit, as he wore his dress, it would be perfectly creased, ironed, fresh, clean. And he would put a rose and put this symbol of the mother and Sri Aurobindo, which had been given to him by the mother. And he would apply a whiff of perfume, because they all knew mother was very sensitive to smells. And it was not just physical smells, but psychological smells. Somebody would enter the room and she would sneeze instantly. And everybody knew what it meant. That the person came in an atmosphere, psychological atmosphere, which was full of impurities or chaos and confusion, and which was often seen in their subsequent interaction with the mother. They had come with a lot of anger or complaints or some other frustrations. But instantly, her physical body would react. And they knew that they had to do what was necessary for her, but also as an expression of the beauty to match the way she manifested beauty in her form and in her life. And I'm pointing to these as examples because the people who came subsequently, who did not have that culturing, well, they don't have it. And we see a very quick, rapid decline in the sensitivity to aesthetics, to beauty, and to this aspect in the culture of the community. I remember once someone had come who was an architect, and I took him to meet the chief engineer of the ashram, and he wanted to know something about what was happening, and he expected to hear something of how the ashram aims at creating beautiful things. And the chief engineer was a very down-to-earth man, and he said, oh, you know what, all this making buildings beautiful and all that, it's all silly, it's all meaningless. It has to be functional, that's all that matters for me. And I said, oops, I brought him to the wrong person. But you can see subsequently, in Sri Aurobindo's room outside, you will see all along the ashram main building, there is a slight ledge which has 3 or 4 little, like this, you will see, I don't know what it's called, little curves. And just under Sri Aurobindo's room, they had to do some repairs, so they chopped that part off, and then they put a flat cement chunk. That's it. And all the rest around has this beautiful, I don't know what it's called. All around the ashram is there, but just that part is flat, blank chunk. Ugly. And they could have easily made it aesthetic, but it was not there. As long as the mother was actively engaged in every detail of ashram life, she pushed people to grow sensitive to beauty and aesthetics, and everything she demanded perfection, neatness, making the vehicle worthy of embodying the divine. From the point she withdrew, and this is in the early 60s, there was the reversal. The tendencies which are associated with the more ascetic and the more callous and the more insensitive began to creep in. And of course, then it tends to grow once it gets a hold. So, you see this double movement. Her push from the strong spiritual nucleus spreading out, and it made a huge impact. It changed a mass of humanity that came to the ashram from an ascetic background and awoke in them this sensitivity to the beauty of the spirit. But it could only push so far, and after a while there's the pushback and the infusion coming from outside, the invasion by the lower elements of mind and life and physical nature. So on all three levels of the intellectual forms, the emotional forms, and the significant physical ritual forms, in all three you'll find this degradation. Again, as an example of this, the precision of timing was one of those things in which we had no compromise. So sometimes we had a public function, one of the two functions, where somebody from the local government, the governor, would be invited. And it was fashionable at that time for politicians to come late, and half an hour late, 1 hour late if they are more important. And so they would be told that you have to come in time. And it happened that they came late and the program started on time. The person came and he was embarrassed. But more recently it changed. The governor came 20 minutes late and the program was held back. You don't stop the program. You don't stop what is being presented to the mother because of some politician who's coming or not. But that value has shifted. The politician is important because you gain favor, you gain power, you gain influence. The mother's physical presence not being seen reduces in importance. And these are inevitable. Perhaps we will push back if we are conscious, but if we are not conscious, these things invade. But the other type of distortion is aping. It tended to be invaded and aped by the lower elements of mind and life and physical nature. And aping is more difficult to manage because they capture a form and express it in a lower grade of consciousness. But the form being the same, you cannot quite make out. Or it still feels like it has a role to play. So I was recently traveling through a city where there was a center, and I always knew it as a Sri Aurobindo center, but now I saw it was being referred to as Sri Aurobindo ashram, and it had inmates who lived there. And I said, this is interesting. So I was looking for inmates, and they would be living a spiritual life, and it was difficult to see. The person in whom I found the most living, I won't say spiritual, but at least a happy glow of light was the maid who was working in the kitchen, who was so loving and so caring and so embracing, and she had somehow imbibed something of the atmosphere of the space. Perhaps there were others whom I did not see, but the terms were the same, the forms were the same, but the spirit was not quite the same. And I find this happening in all of the centers connected with Sri Aurobindo's work, where because it was done at some point, it continues to be done, the form is there, but the spirit tends to fade. And I'm giving these examples because they are nearest to us, they are happening within our lifetime, but consider this happening over a few centuries. And then, of course, you can see how far it could go. You see these with many of the larger religions which have been around for a few hundred or thousands of years, and aping of the form is where those who have just entered the practice are now imitating something which is characteristic of those who hold the spiritual content. He uses the word ape, and it's very significant. He doesn't say imitation, he says ape, because aping is when an ape imitates the human, fundamentally of a lower order of consciousness, incapable of understanding the higher, but imitating the form. So the human waves and the ape waves back. The human smiles and the ape shows his teeth, but for the ape, showing teeth is to show anger and threat. Completely different meaning, but the form is the same. It was this mixture and alloy and invasion of the spurious, this profanation of the mysteries and the loss of their truth and significance, as well as the misuse of the occult power that comes by communication with invisible forces, that was most dreaded by the early mystics and prevented by secrecy, by strict discipline, by restriction to the few fit initiates. Now again, there are many important facets to this statement. The early mystics were afraid of this. What was it that they were afraid of? And he gives a list of things, and we'll look at each of those. First he says, mixture and alloy and invasion of the spurious. Now spurious is counterfeit. But what is the character of counterfeit? External form is same, material used is different. So you will have a counterfeit watch. It has the same label, the same appearance. The machinery inside is totally different. Counterfeit books, paper used, ink used is of a different kind. Maybe even the text may be different, but the packaging is the same cover. So this mixture and alloy and invasion of the spurious, the three things, the mixture, alloy and invasions, all three involve this counterfeiting. That's the common feature of them. The form remains, the inside is changed. This profanation of the mysteries, where you lose the sense of respect and sacred, and it is made almost like a routine. In the dining room, it was one of the instructions that the mother gave. Every morning, or every time the food was laid, the door was closed. There was a queue waiting to take food, but the door would be closed. The people who are going to serve would stand there. The food is placed, and the person in charge of the dining room would be standing. All together, there would be 1 minute of concentration to invoke the mother's presence. Everybody was conscious, intensely concentrated. When the 1 minute was over, somebody would ring the bell, the door would open, and the line would walk in, take the food, and go through. The people walking in had no knowledge, or perhaps no value. Maybe they had, but it didn't matter. The people serving and the food, that's where the important thing took place. And it was on mother's instructions that this was done, so that the spiritual force that she had placed there to infuse into the food would be called and activated. Now at some point, as this people's change, it becomes a routine, it becomes a ritual. So now, okay, it's time, stand, close your eyes. Maybe you close your eyes, but your mind is elsewhere. You look around, someone rings the bell, it goes. It has become a routine. And you can feel the difference when it's done like that. The people who are serving, when they were concentrated, later when they would begin to serve, you could feel their state of consciousness was different. But when they're not concentrated, you can see they're just throwing food. Move quickly, and that goes. But this is the profanation of the mysteries. What took place at that point was a profound mystery. Mother explained what she had done, that she had put a certain force. And there's a force which is put into the food, infused into the food. And that's why she said she did not want the dining room food to be given to beggars. And I remember somebody who came from a more charitable Christian background, and he, in a public discussion, he said, why should that be? You should give freely to those who are needy. And the explanation given to him was, it has nothing to do with giving alms to the poor. Mother explained she did not want the spiritual force put in the food to be wasted. And it was the conservation of the force. In another context, when somebody complained about waste of money, Mother Riley said, I'm not so worried about waste of money. I'm worried about the waste of spiritual force. That is for me more serious. And what that means, we have to recognize more deeply. You see, money is part of a process that she could draw more if needed. But the spiritual force is gathered, intensified, and infused, and it takes a certain effort to build that intensity and to give it. And if that is dispersed, well, you don't get it back easily. So that is another example of this profanation of the mysteries, where you lose the deeper sense of what's really happening. If you take the example of the dining room, think of it in this way. When you pray and invoke the mother herself, materializes her consciousness to infuse on a material density into the food. So that when you eat the physical food, the physical density of her consciousness is going into your body and working, spreading into the cells and doing a work of change there. And if you're conscious of this when you invoke, if you're conscious of this when you eat, if you're conscious of this after eating, when the food is being absorbed, spread after digestion, then you will be able to assist in that process and greatly amplify that result. Of course, you could be chatting around, laughing, chatting, making jokes, gossiping, discussing politics, and something may still happen, but profanation of the mysteries and the loss of their truth and significance. That behind those symbols there was something of great significance, and that is forgotten. In the Christian tradition, there is a very important ritual where the body of Christ and the blood of Christ is given to people. If you think about it, the problem of the body and blood, flesh and blood, is that it has already reduced it to, meat. Flesh and blood, which is part of the meat. So literally people understand it as the physical tissue of Christ's body. But if you go into the deeper symbolism behind what blood represents as life force, what the flesh represents as the substantiality of the spiritual consciousness, the whole thing has a much deeper sense. And if it is merely reduced to a ritual which now can be replicated by taking any material, it loses the deeper sense of what that is. And it is the same idea when we invoke the mother's force into the food. The truth and significance of it is gradually forgotten. There are even things now which have become so ritual that it is almost meaningless. There was something called a ceremony which is called prosperity. Every first of the month, all the disciples joined a queue, climb up the stairs to go to a particular hall where the mother herself would stand and in a box give you your monthly necessities, for which maybe 20 days or 10 days before you would give a little note of what you need. I need a matchbox, I need some soap, I need a notepad, I need a pen, whatever it is, and she would give it to you. Now think about how silly it is. Why should mother herself stand there and give these things to people? Right? She could have easily delegated somebody to do it, which eventually she had to when she withdrew. Why is it you should have to ask, I need a pen, I need this, and then she gives it to you later, on a particular day, all at the same time? Why not just have one store where you can go every time you need a pen, you take? And behind this was a profound truth. The full sense of it is now completely lost. And the truth began like this. When you joined the ashram, everything that you owned was given to the Guru. All your material possessions, not a single coin remaining, not a single object, except perhaps the clothes you're wearing at that moment, everything was handed over to the Guru, including yourself and all of yourself, including your mind, including your emotions and desires, including your body and all its habits and preconceptions and rigidities and inertia and dullness and everything. All is given to them, no exception. And then the mother gives back to you what is necessary for your sadhana. She gives you a room to stay, she gives you a mat and a water pot and clothes and whatever else. And every time that you need something, you ask for it. It is a process, you write it, it goes and it is given by her to you. So that there is nothing in your life which is yours, all belongs to the divine, including yourself. Now that's a state of intense self-giving and self-consecration, to be made as total as possible. And for this reason, that whole ritual and process was in place. So when people went during that period, they went with that intention, we are going to receive from mother. And maybe she gives us a bar of soap, but the bar of soap is to be used and I'm going to use it judiciously, not wastefully. And it is she who gives I have nothing which is mine. Everything is hers. Everything I do, therefore, is also given to her. And it makes for the most complete experience. Bit by bit, after the mother withdrew, after it became more formal, somebody else takes the place. We still had the sense that you went there, mother would be there. It was still coming from the mother, even if somebody else stands. And at some point, there was a bureaucracy that came in that would say, oh, you need an umbrella? I'm sorry, umbrella is given only once in 6 years. So if you have lost yours, you have to wait another 4 years before we can give you an umbrella. That's ridiculous if you have to go in the rain. So what do? You get a little bit of money. One of your friends comes, a relative says, I'm so happy to see you here. What can I do for you? I need an umbrella because I can't go in the rain. So he gives it to you. And then after a while, he says, you know what? I leave you some money. You buy what you need. And bit by bit, every ashramite today has a bank account, has necessarily to buy things. And by the way, what happened to the prosperity exercise? It's become almost a pointless ritual. People still go and come. You see them going up and down. They run up, they run down with their little box, take out their little thing, give the box away. Little thing goes into the pocket and it's done. Or what has happened more and more as people have grown older, I can't go up the stairs, I'll take it from the office. Just keep it there on the side. I'll come tomorrow and take it from the office. The whole exercise has suddenly lost all its deeper sense. And do you still need to continue it? So either the truth has to regenerate in new form, or the truth itself withdraws and a new plateau of a lower grade of commitment becomes the norm. Which one will it be? Well, depends. But in the process is the loss of the truth and significance of this greater mystery. As well as, now comes a different side. All this is in something lost. On the other side is the power which came with the spirit, and particularly with the occult aspect of the knowledge of the spirit. So the misuse of the occult power that comes by communication with invisible forces. Now, communication with invisible forces is a very general term. Communication does not mean, as you would say, good morning and help me here and you do this. That's one kind of communication. But the sense of communication here is more generic. You enter into awareness of a subtler grade of consciousness and its associated power, and are able to exercise it or exercise the corresponding faculties of that grade. You're able to draw upon its action into life. This communication is inevitable in any spiritual growth. By the very fact that you rise into a supra-rational consciousness, intuitive, in intuition is identity with what you know. In identity is power to act in what you know. So inherently in the opening to the intuitive consciousness is a power of action on that intuitive plane. And because of the working of intuition, it can lean down into the mind and life and even matter. So an intuitively centered person can, as if either effortlessly reflect the thought of another, or lean into the mind of another and feel where is the confusion, where is the problem. And in the very nature of intuition, he is one with that which he knows and feels, and therefore can gently shift. Here is a cloud, here is confusion, and gently infusing light or clarity, or just gently pushing away the cloud, and the problem is gone. The person feels cleared, freed, uplifted. Inherent to all spiritual development is a certain power of action that comes with it, because, well, if you say spirituality begins with the intuitive, with it comes this power. But from the intuition, on all the lower ranges, to some degree, the power will be there. If nothing else, it will be inadvertent. The very fact that there's a contained spiritual energy, when you need something, you say, oh, I wish I had this. The act of that wish creates a ripple in the atmosphere that ripples out to draw that thing which is required, and it happens, even without you consciously intending for it to happen. Just the fact that there's a need and a call creates as if a suction, and because it's a spiritual force, it's not bounded to time or space. It can reach out and begin a process, which eventually will produce an outcome. And this is the reason why, when the first spiritual turn takes place, if there has not been sufficient purity, often there is an automatic misuse, because the person now puts out a desire knowing that it will be fulfilled. Or in a burst of anger, there's a force thrown out which goes and causes harm. And the greater the awakening in consciousness, the more the matching purification that inadvertently the harm may not be caused. I remember this incident which we saw happen. My teacher was on a Sunday morning. He was very particular. He wanted that time for some work. And someone phoned from Chennai and said, "By the way, we are coming down this morning to meet you." And he said, "Please, not in the morning. Can you come later in the afternoon?" They said, No, we have already started. We are on the way." And he put down the phone and he said with some vehemence, he said, "I don't want them to come in the morning." And as it happened, their car had a breakdown soon after. They were stuck and they reached in the afternoon. And he was very apologetic. He said, "I'm sorry." But it was spontaneous. It was at a very human level. He said, "I don't want them to come in the morning." But being in that state of concentration, it had an immediate result. I saw many such things happening. A friend of mine who was in the school, he had completed his education. He had been given a room which was in the ashram complex, residential complex, which he said it was smelling bad. It was so horrible. He couldn't sleep at night. It was unlivable. And maybe it was given to him because the person didn't care or didn't want him. Eventually he left the ashram. But at that time he came to me and he said to me, "Panditji is in the housing committee. Can you please request him to give me a different room?" I said, "Yes, surely I'll convey your request." So I come home, and at that time it was a month before Panditji left his body. He was very sick and he had stopped going to the committee meetings. But I went and faithfully described to him and conveyed the message. And then a few days later, my friend comes and says, "Thank you so much. I've just received a message. Now I've been given another room." So I came back and reported to Panditji. I knew for a fact he had not gone to the ashram. He had not phoned anybody. And I said to him that, "Did you..." And it was clear he did not do it physically. The fact that he was asked for that help, whatever he had to do, or it happened spontaneously by the very fact of his state of being. And it was around the same time that somebody was sick in the ashram. He had taken to the nursing home, and Panditji said, "No, it's not a sickness." There was a spiritual experience which reflected in the body in a sharp way, and it seemed to be like a heart attack. So later, that person said the same thing to his disciples, and I heard from them, and I said, "Oh, that's what Panditji had said." And one of the persons who was a bit of let's say, atheist or questioner, always challenging, he said, "Oh, in that case, Panditji can know." I said, "Yes, I can ask." And I asked Panditji, and he said, "Yes, of course one can know whatever is required without needing to go there." And we saw this happen with him all the time. And he said, "Oh, then I want to come and test him." And when I conveyed this to Panditji, he made a gesture of disgust. But you see here the difference in a consciousness in which spontaneously there is access to knowledge and of course access to an action which comes with that knowledge, in the freedom of the consciousness. And someone comes and says, "I want to test you." What? Not interested. No meaning, no interest. But that shows that's the aping level of mentality, which does not recognize the sacredness, wants to reduce it to something which is profane and a demonstration. So this is the other misuse of occult power that comes by communication with invisible forces. How far can this go? And we have so many stories in history of people being able to summon the rains or to drive out the rains or to produce all kinds of results at will, who inevitably, because it was an occult power and owned by the ego, were always misusing. And often the power had to be withdrawn. But among the spiritual, you find Sri Aurobindo's famous aphorism that the great saints have railed against miracles. Greater saints have performed, great saints have performed miracles. Greater saints have railed against them. But the greatest have both performed them and railed against them. Because it's a spontaneous action of a liberated consciousness. But the misuse comes when the consciousness is small, but with a limited access in the beginning. And so all of this, that was the most dreaded by the early mystics and prevented by secrecy, by strict discipline, by restriction to the few fit inmates. You keep the knowledge and the spiritual power itself held back. Secrecy is not merely what you teach, it's also how you withhold the power itself. And you will see in the most of these more mystic traditions where the spreading is weak and the holding is strong, they will have layers. They'll have a center, a room in which everything is held, or an object which is central, which will be always closed, opened only once in a while, and then around that another layer and another layer to protect even physically the density of the presence and the atmosphere held. Strict discipline, of course, in the practices for the purity and in the knowledge and transmission of knowledge, but also in the access. And restriction to the few initiates, and you have layers of initiates. The beginners only come so far, those who are more developed can have more access, and so on. And that access is not only in physical space, but in access of knowledge, and of course in the power which comes with the knowledge. At the center are those who are most ready. And in this way they created the protection. So this is where we pause. And he gives one more, another untoward result or peril of the diffusive movement and the consequent invasion has been the intellectual formalization of spiritual knowledge into dogma and the materialization of living practice into dead mass of cult and ceremony and ritual, mechanization, etc., out of which the spirit often withdraws. So this we will look at in detail the next Sunday. So here Sri Aurobindo has described the movement first of concentration to build something intensely, and then the diffusion to spread it out into humanity. When we look at the current phase in humanity generally, on a large scale, it is a diffusive phase. All the occult traditions which had secrecies up to, let's say, 100 years ago, have opened their gates and allowed increasingly diffusion. And the most spiritual have opened completely. Sri Aurobindo's entire teaching and the mother's teaching are all available in published books. Nothing held secret. All is open. Of course, the ability to understand and access what he teaches is what differentiates. But everything is out there, nothing held back. All access to the facilities in the ashram, everything is open. Even Sri Aurobindo's room would be left open. Anyone could walk in until about 20 years ago, when for practical reasons they put restrictions only to reduce numbers. But the samadhi and everything is open, nothing held back. What can we do to not allow overwhelming of the dilution is secrecy is not needed. Strict discipline also, Mother never enforced strict discipline, but some inner discipline. Some inward conservation, if that is the nature of secrecy, to hold within you and not spill out. And the restriction of a gathered, concentrated core which holds the spiritual force. This would be necessary in any case, even if there is a diffusive movement. And all of this we have seen as a risk. It is necessary. The expansive movement is necessary for the spiritual urge in evolutionary nature. So all this we will take up next Sunday. We can concentrate on this for half a minute and see how we can translate these principles into our daily life and practice.